Welcome into a new edition of Carps Corner. Sport has been fantastic. There's been a lot going on, some good, some bad, a lot of NFL news, a lot of college football news. So I appreciate everybody tuning in, subscribing, sharing this via social media. And it's grown immensely here in the last couple of weeks. So as we sit here and dive through the NFL offseason, look at college football topics, general sports topics in general, dive into the Ohio State stuff, especially with spring game. I know a lot of people are passionate followers of Ohio State who subscribe. So really appreciate that. Going to continue to provide hopefully all the content and insight that you're ultimately looking for. So going to continue to do a little bit of that here tonight. Got some college football news. We'll dive into Dabo Swinney, a little bit what he's talking about. And, Clemson's been incredibly successful, but people who fail to adapt ultimately get left in the dust. And so we'll see how that kind of transitions and that pivots as things begin to move. So we've got that going on. We've got some news. Tom Brady, talk a little bit about him with the Dolphins, the realistic nature of that, what could have been promised, how that could have potentially turned in, and why I think it's important. People hear a lot of this stuff about different contracts and things, why that's important to the NFL. JC's Tretter, the union president, also had some comments about Deshaun Watsons' contract, how that potentially looks, and maybe that could be an inflection point in the NFL. And really, as well, the Washington Commanders and Dan Snyder, because there's some unbelievable stuff that's ultimately coming out about him. New things that might actually get the owner's attention, more so than any of the sexual harassment bit or anything that's happened before. I'll tell you why it matters and why they ultimately care about it, and they being the owners. But I want to start first and foremost, Dabo Swinney. Let's think about Dabo Swinney, how important he is to the state of college football. He's taken Clemson. He's been there 20 years, I believe, 14 as the head coach. They've had 10 straight win seasons or 10, 11 win seasons. They've been rolling for the last decade, won a couple of national championships. And even this year, in spite of all the trouble they had and DJ Uiagalelei, and all the struggles he had at quarterback. They lost Brent Venables as their DC this year. They lost their offensive coordinators. They were in kind of a period of transition. And despite all of that, this was a Clemson team that still managed to go 10-3. They were 1.4-3, and I guess, rattled off 10 straight games. And no one really talked about it, just simply due to the fact that, they weren't really a national player. They weren't the national title contender that they've been for so many years. And so people kind of laid back and thought, okay, this Clemson team, they're maybe not quite as good as they've been. They were out of it. I believe Pitt ultimately won the ACC. And so, they weren't even able to do that. But they did have a heck of a year. By 90% of college football programs, you're winning 10 games. That's a heck of a deal. So for 11 years in a row, Dabo Swinney has won 10 games. That's serious. Now, got some quarterback issues this year. Had some coaches leave, and Dabo Swinney has been vehemently against the transfer portal. He's been fairly resistant to NIL because he doesn't like the idea of student athletes getting paid, his players getting paid. He thinks it'll kind of ruin the team environment. And so as I sit here and kind of look at it, I guess I could get that, Dabo. I could get behind it. And I understand that. I'm a traditionalist, but I'm also a realist. And so I understand that when you add an ingredient into something that's been pretty successful for a long time, it's going to change it up. And that's college football. And not just adding one ingredient. You got an NIL, you got the transfer portal. I mean, those are some pretty big deals that are ultimately happening now. And you kind of smushed them in there together. And so ultimately with that, there's going to be some different things that are happening. And it's going to be a lot more difficult to manage for coaches. And so I understand that. So Dabo doesn't like that. But he said, that he's not going to, I guess, oppose NIL, but he doesn't necessarily like the idea of guys getting paid. So he comes out and, he makes this analogy, this allusion, because he sits down with ESPN and they're talking about all these things. And is this kind of the downfall of Clemson? Because they've got to get their quarterback fixed, number one, and get that situation figured out. And their defense is what saved them this year. And Brent Venables is no longer going to be there. He's the head coach at OU. He's been the defensive coordinator there for much of their success. And so if they want to continue to have that, they're going to have to find a way to replace them because their defense bailed them out this season. So they've got that also to deal with. But Dabo Swinney has bristled at this many times, that the idea of student athletes, college players, ultimately getting paid. He doesn't like it. And so he goes on to make this analogy, and they're talking about, the question is asked you for, what do you say when players and parents or whoever brings up the fact that, hey, coaches, you're making a lot of money. You and Nick Saban are very well paid. And so this is his response. We're going to throw up on the screen. Well, Nick Saban is 70 years old. I'm 52 years old. Now, none of us set markets on what we do. We live in a capitalist society. The head of Delta probably makes a lot more than the people who are actually checking your baggage in, but those people are as vital as anybody. None of us set markets on what we do. It's a free market we live in anything. It's just our jobs that are so visible and so public. I can tell you this, none of us got into coaching to make money, but I don't apologize for being successful. Now, I agree with that. Most coaches don't get into it for the money. They get in it because they love the game. They love, impacting players, developing young people, all of those things, regardless of sport. Now, when it comes to football and men's basketball, yeah, you get financially rewarded at a pretty high level. And so that's a nice cherry on top. It's a nice bonus for those coaches. And I'm not going to besmirch him of that. Dabo's been resistant to NIL. He doesn't necessarily want to build a team through a transfer portal, which I don't think any coach does. No realistic coach says, hey, I want to go make sure that we're bringing in players from all across the country, from different colleges, because you're getting guys who are leaving somewhere. They're probably leaving because they weren't having success. And so they're going to bring some of their problems there with them. They may be talented, but it's not a guy that you recruited. Plus, when you do that, you upset the apple cart a little bit with the players you already have. And that might mean that you're missing on guys as well. And so it's a whole host of problems. Now, it doesn't mean that you don't want to sit here and cherry pick and pluck guys off that, hey, this guy's leaving for this reason or that guy's leaving for that reason. And I think we can fit them into our culture and be okay. That's perfectly fine. But Dabo Swinney talking about how he's vehemently against players getting paid. And he talks about this, how it's going to potentially be used against him. And I worry, if I'm a Clemson fan, if I sit here and hear him saying these things, and Dabo's been brutally honest about it. And brutal honesty is great. I respect coaches that come out and say exactly what they're thinking, but he has to understand that it's going to be used against him in recruiting. And Clemson isn't Alabama. Heck, Clemson isn't even Georgia. They're not USC. They're not Texas. They're not Ohio State, Michigan, Florida. If you look at their history and their success that they've had, Dabo Swinney has basically written the recent book of success. And much like Joe Paterno did it at Penn State or Bobby Bowden did it at Florida State, it's tough to pass that torch and pass that candle and have that same level of success with maybe another coach, or maybe when things begin to wane. And so Clemson, they're in the ACC. They're financially bound. They don't have the big TV deals that the SEC and the Big Ten have. So Dabo has to continuously raise money. They have to make sure they're going to be able to provide NIL. They have to continuously upgrade facilities. And so Clemson, while they can rule the ACC, they can still compete in college football. They can compete at a high level and they can win national championships, but they have a lot less wiggle room when it comes to recruiting and when it comes to player retention. And so Dabo ultimately has to be careful about what he says and how he addresses things, knowing that people are going to take what he says and use those things against him when he's trying to procure players. Because Clemson, for a long time, cranked out wide receivers, and they had a couple of really good quarterbacks in a row. And when you can do that, they kind of rewrote the book on the tall, long receivers and how effective those guys were. Good quarterbacks to throw them the football. And they had a really good defense that was very versatile under Brent Venables with some really good defensive linemen. Heck, they had 3 defensive linemen taken in the first round in one draft. And so they checked all of those boxes. But you fade off a little bit in recruiting, and all of a sudden you begin to have issues. And that's what I worry about a little with Clemson. They had a little bit of a downturn last year, and they lost to Georgia in a close one. But their offense wasn't as high flying as it's been. They didn't necessarily have the running game that they've had. Their offensive line looked really rough. And so as Dabo comes out and says some of these things and doesn't want to address a lot of stuff in the portal, you have to wonder how readily they'll be able to have a quick fix for some of these problems. I'm not predicting Clemson's demise, but I'm saying they're getting to a point, if they have another year that was a little rough like this, and Dabo continues to speak freely and, oppose some of the players' rights things that I think so many coaches, whether they agree with privately or not, publicly, they're going to come out and say the right thing. Hurts them in recruiting. And ultimately that could lead to a trend. The ACC still isn't great. And so Dabo's got a leg up on everybody, but I think it's time to watch a little bit and beware and really pay attention to Clemson for this 2022 season to see how it ultimately pans out for the Tigers. I want to transition to the Washington Commanders football team. Now, a lot has been made and been said about all the things that Dan Snyder's done, been a bad guy, the sexual harassment, everything that has been going on there. A lot of bad stuff for your Washington Commanders, formerly Redskins fan. The football team in between. They've struggled with their product on the field. They've had the off the field problems, the sexual harassment claims by cheerleaders, by staff. Dan Snyder's just generally not really all that well received. A lot of the fans don't like him. They used to be on, a sellout list forever with one of the NFL's biggest stadiums. That's kind of evaporated. They want a new stadium in DC. I don't know if he's got the political support to be able to get it done. And so there's a lot of people that's like, hey, Dan Snyder should sell the team. NFL owners never want to see another owner forced to sell the team. They don't want that precedent being set. And so that's why when all the sexual harassment, all the sexual assault things, and all of these different claims that were coming out about the Redskins, we'll do an independent investigation. We'll button it up and seal it. No one will see it by us. It'll be internal. We'll release what we ultimately want to, and that'll be a way to push some of the protests at bay, and we'll feel better about the situation. And the NFL owners will just keep on going, and we'll throw Roger Goodell out to take the slings and arrows. The one thing NFL owners care about is money. And if they feel like they're being cheated by one of their fellow owners, then you will begin to see guys turn their backs and maybe begin to see this push. And so that's why it's so incredible to see the things that Dan Snyder and the Washington Commanders are ultimately accused of. One of the proudest franchises at one point in the NFL. Heck, they won 3 Super Bowls. And so this is what's so crazy is when I say stealing from the other owners, the way the NFL's collectively bargained agreement works is there's like basically a 50-50 split, with TV money and TV deals. And then the owners, they get a little bit more individually with their profits. And so on their stadium. So all the money collectively goes into a pot, but owners get to keep more of their luxury suites. They get to keep a greater percentage of their in-stadium marketing. Their stadium seating, they share some of that too, but they get to keep a pretty large chunk of that. But still, all of that money gets shared equally among the teams. That's why the NFL has worked so well for so long. And so they take those percentages, divvy it up, and that's kind of the pot that everybody pulls from. Now, outside of the games, owners, depending on their agreement with the stadium, they have the ability to make money off concerts, off other games there, and things like that. That's why Jerry Jones has 1 million events down in Texas Stadium. You know why? Because he's making money off of it. That's why. And he's a smart marketer, and he built a stadium that's multi-purpose and huge. It can do a lot of things. And so this is where Dan Snyder rather, may have gotten himself into trouble. And it may come from a guy who no one really knows, Jason Friedman, who works as a controller, works in the Washington Commanders front office. We'll throw this up. These are his quotes. So there are 2 sets of books, he told the committee, in reference to the House Oversight Committee that was looking into this. So in this particular case, there's a set of books that are submitted to the NFL that doesn't include the $162,000. But then there's a set of books kept internally shown to Mr. Snyder. And Mr. Snyder, I believe just Mr. Snyder actually, and the people in his inner circle, that shows that we actually did include the $162,000 of juice. And so what that means is there are a couple of events. They referenced the Notre Dame Navy game and the Kenny Chesney concert. where they don't have to share that money with the NFL. And so Dan Snyder allegedly counted some of his stadium dollars that he made during games as part of those two events, funneled it off, money that was supposed to go to be shared by the owners, funneled it off into those two events for accounting purposes so that he'd be able to keep that money and not have to share it. That is what is going to get the owners really upset. The fact that Dan Snyder may have cheated his fellow owners out of dollars. It's fraud. Technically, it's illegal. And he could be going to jail. It violates agreements. It's defrauding your fellow owners. And that's what's going to fire him up. The NFL owners, they say they care about all those other things. They care about money. They care about on-field success and filling their stadiums. And honestly, that's about it. And they care about their players. And some do care about the fans. And I don't want to paint them all in a bad light. But those are their primary objectives. And they're not going to force anybody to sell a team unless they feel like a person's bad for business. And not only bad for business, but then ultimately cheating them, which is what Dan Snyder is now being accused of off of the investigation, rather, by the House Oversight Committee and Reform Committee. And so with that, this is a huge bombshell. And it's going to be interesting how the league handles this internally, because this is kind of the first time that you've heard something like this kind of leak out, where one owner may have been hiding revenues, and that owner being Dan Snyder, who is not widely appreciated throughout the football landscape, and really not even by his own franchise and fan base, but they may have been sheltering dollars to prevent them from being shared. Think about what that would be like with anybody, within friends, among family. Whenever someone would be hiding money that was supposed to go to a collective pot that was supposed to be split up, they'd be pretty upset. And these begin to get big dollar amounts when you start talking to these NFL owners. Well, you know what? They didn't get rich by getting taken advantage of. And so that might be the straw that ultimately breaks the camel's back. Moving on, J.C. Tretter, the president of the Players Union, or the head of the Players Union, player representative, comes out and said he wants to challenge agents. What does that mean? I want to challenge agents. Well, here's why I want to challenge them. The quarterback that just got signed by the Cleveland Browns, just got a 5-year, $230 million guaranteed. So he wants to challenge other agents to start working their deals like Deshaun Watson. He defined it as, quote, a turning point potentially for the players. Major League Baseball, NBA, NHL. I don't believe anywhere in their collective bargaining agreement does it say they have to have guaranteed contracts. All of a sudden, people started getting them, so other players started ratcheting up, and all of a sudden that becomes precedent. The owners are going to fight like hell against this. They don't want to see it happen. They don't want to see the, quote, turning point where now all contracts are guaranteed. Kirk Cousins had a little bit a few years back, but this mega deal by Deshaun Watson, now, Union Pres J.C. Tretter coming out and saying, hey, this could be a turning point, wants to see all agents push for this. I get it. I understand it. And it's big time. And I think it's going to ultimately be a great deal for all of the players. Now, one important note for the Browns, and this is going to be interesting for the owners as they sit here and try to solve this problem. But one interesting note for the Browns is the fact that you have to have cash to guarantee big deals like that. You have to be able to escrow a large chunk of the signing bonus dollars. So the Cleveland Browns had to put almost $170 million that they weren't even going to pay him for this season, but for future years into escrow to be sitting there, since it's all guaranteed to Deshaun Watson, to make sure that they have it. And so for owners who might be a little cash poor, this could cause a problem. And that's why some of them are going to fight like heck against this, because they don't want to be in a situation where they're sitting here and writing $100 million checks that they have to put in escrow, so they can't use that money anymore. And frankly, some of them might not even have it because they have to pay out of operations. So to write a big check and drop a nut like that, that's going to be rough. It's going to be rough for some of those owners. And so there's going to be a big pushback. And I'm excited to see, the negotiations as people look for extensions, at the start of training camp, and at the end of the season, when you get in next year's free agency, this could be an inflection point. J.C. Tretter's calling for it to be a turning point, and it just might be. And then lastly, the Tom Brady situation. He's returning to Tampa Bay. But I don't think people realize potentially how close he was to going to Miami and some of the things that were promised him by owner Stephen Ross. I've touched on this a little bit before, but the fact that he was going to potentially get ownership, have a front office position similar to Derek Jeter, and the new news that Sean Payton, who had retired, potentially a package deal going back to New Orleans, or both of them going to Miami with compensation going to Tampa for Tom Brady, and then some ultimately going to New Orleans for Sean Payton. But the package deal of Tom Brady and Sean Payton to Miami should have been pretty darn exciting. And I don't know if it's a coincidence or not that the day Tom Brady, I believe, retired was the day of the Brian Flores lawsuit filing. And so maybe at that point he was like, this thing looks like it's done and over with, before he realized he ultimately wanted to go back to Tampa. Or maybe it was just a coincidence. But I do believe that was real. I do believe that the fact that there was probably some ownership and different things promised, I think that was real. But the fact that Sean Payton was on board, or potentially, I think that that's really big news. It's something that could have really changed the balance of power a little bit in the AFC East. Tom Brady at Miami going up to New England twice a year. Pretty exciting.